It's been a battle for parental rights like no other, and Rebel News has been covering it for you every step of the way. Today, I'm standing in front of Vancouver's BC Court of Appeal on May 31st to bring you an update on the BC father who was imprisoned after speaking out about the medical transitioning of his child without his consent. That father hopes that what happens in today's hearing will result in him not having to go back to jail. Andrea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and for those of you who may not be aware of this case, I'll give you a quick refresher before I head into the courtroom. In 2018, a BC father who I'm legally obligated to refer to as CD filed an application to protect his then minor trans-identified child from being medically transitioned. The courts did not grant this father the right to protect his child from that life-altering decision. At one point, his speech was even compelled by the courts, who forbade him from using biologically correct terms when referencing his child's gender, and compared the father's misgendering his own child as being family violence. CD was also slapped with publication ban after publication ban that prevented him and even journalists like myself from letting you see the full story behind why he felt so strongly that he was protecting his child in pursuing such legal action. Flash forward to 2020, and this father found himself in and out of criminal court, accused of breaching publication bans after he spoke out, and convicted to 6 months in prison and ordered to pay a $30,000 fine for contempt of court in relation to the gag orders. But today, however, counsel from Johnson Doyle, Vancouver criminal lawyers, will be arguing that CD, who is currently on bail after serving 2 months of his sentence, not be sent back to jail for the rest of his sentence on the grounds that his previous counsel was insufficient and the sentence itself is too stiff. I'm going to head in, and I'll be back in seconds for you with an update on what goes down. All right, we're out on break, giving you a quick recap, and make sure you watch this full report because I will have an interview with CD himself, whom, of course, is limited on what he can say. But I was surprised to find that he had two counsel representing himself. Previously, it was just Samara Hiscock from that firm I mentioned earlier, but he also had a new lawyer from that firm who did most of the submissions today. His name is Brent Anderson. It's hard to say. I'm not a judge. I'm not a lawyer, but it seemed to be as though his submissions were going well, in particular because when the Crown gave her submissions, she was challenged quite often from the 3 appeal justices that will be ruling over this matter. Also, perhaps surprising to some, is that CD's former counsel himself, Carrie Linda, was also in the room watching. That is the counsel that Anderson and Hiscock is in fact arguing was insufficient for CD as part of their reasoning for arguing that he shouldn't be going back to jail. All right, we meet again. Still, our viewers cannot see your face, but you just stepped out of your appeal hearing. Tell us a little bit about how you're feeling.
You know, I'm feeling fairly confident, I guess. You know, I had 2 lawyers today. I had Brent Anderson and Samara Hiscock from the Johnson & Doyle law firm, and I wasn't expecting to have 2 of them today, but they both showed up, and Brent Anderson did actually all of the arguments. And when we left, he said, he doesn't think they could have done a whole lot better. He's pretty happy with the way he saw things unfold, and I'll be honest, it seemed a bit like Crown struggled. In fact, at one point, they sort of got caught up in the fact of why were they satisfied with 45 days back in April of 2021, and all of a sudden they've kind of turncoated on this and said, well, after seeing the reasons of judgment from Tammin, we suddenly believed that Crown, our position back then, it was not adequate, and that we are pushing now for the full 6 months and a $30,000 fine, and that got questioned by the judges as well as why this flip-flop, and it just seemed like their arguments were weak, but again, you never know because there's how these things go because judges are a bit hard to read. I thought in other times that I was going to get a really good ruling, and it ended up being a complete nightmare, like family violence. When I thought this first judge that I had, Bowden, was kind of this grandfather figure that seemed to understand this stuff, and all of a sudden it was the worst ruling I got in one of them. So
I've seen situations where you go into the court and you end up being arrested or apprehended. This time you're still free. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was a development from the last bail extension I had in December. And what happened there was essentially the judge at that time said, well, what's the point of constantly having you surrender to the sheriff's office? You sit in that jail cell at the courthouse awaiting what happens. And he kind of thought, why can't he just stay out on bail until there's a ruling? And so there's no definite time when I have to turn myself in. I'm simply out on bail until this 3-panel Court of Appeal comes up with the ruling whatever way it is. So if they decide to put me back in prison, then I will go back to prison at that time to make that choice. But if they don't, I don't go back to prison at all. So I'm not doing what was happening before, where I'm kind of sitting in there waiting for decisions to be made. They're letting me out as I await them.
It's surprising to see that your former counsel, Carrie Linda, was also in the room today, since that is part of your appeal, really, saying that there was insufficient counsel. Were you surprised at all to see him?
I wasn't really surprised. I know Carrie Lynn has been invested in this, for better or for worse. In this case, it was, if you're a Carrie Lynn, it's not a good day. I mean, my lawyer, went after him for inefficient counsel. In a big way, for not doing things properly for the plea deal with the joint submission, and of course that all got delved into, it seemed to me like the Court of Appeal judges recognized that, there was a lot of errors that were made that led to the sentence that I got. And to get to that place, yes, Carrie Lynn obviously was under a lot of intense scrutiny today.
Well, time will tell. The judges have said it will be about a few weeks or weeks. Maybe it will be months before we hear this decision. But in the meantime, how are you holding up? How is your dog doing?
I think the dog is fine. He's actually being babysat or dog sat somewhere right now, and he seems to be doing well. The lady where he's at and the daughter was going to walk him a couple times a day, and she said he's settled right in, and they're having a lot of fun with him. So I may just let them have him for a day or two more here. So take a dog holiday and let them have some fun. But yeah, he's in a good place, and that's where he was. But it was in preparation for not knowing what was going to happen. Like, everything was in place for me to be, put back in prison this afternoon. So, and that's when you ask, how are you holding up? That's the frustrating part, is you never know how to hold up, because you never know what's going to happen next. And so you prepare for the worst, and in this case, nothing's happened. Now I'm just in a waiting game again. But at least the process is done, and now I'm waiting. But again, it's a waiting game that I still now have to be prepared again and make sure all the stuff is in place down for a time down the road.
Has any of the, mainstream sort of legacy media reached out to you recently about your case? Did you hear of them having any interest in your appeal case this time around?
I haven't heard anything. I put out a feeler to the Toronto Star, Doug Kwan, just because he had actually been following this quite faithfully through most of it, and I thought maybe he would be interested in how this ended, but I never heard back. Is there some sort of big alternative media? The Daily Wire texted me this morning with Matt Walsh, and they just want to make sure they get an update sometime today as well. And so, they're kind of big in the U.S., but again, they're not what you're asking about. It's the mainstream Vancouver Sun, global news kind of publications, media outlets. So in that sense, not really.
Well, thank you. We're happy to cover the other side of the story that's being ignored, really, in such an unprecedented fashion. So thanks.
All right, thank you.
If you appreciate that I had my boots on the ground, and in fact, Rebel News was the only news here covering this story for you, then you should know that we are completely independent of government interests, but also completely dependent on your support to keep going. If you'd like to support our journalism and keep the other side of the story going strong, you can do so in a fun way. Head to our store at rebelnewsstore.com. Buy yourself some fun patriotic gear, and when you do, you can use coupon code DREA10 to save, and you're supporting your favorite independent news outlet. We appreciate your support.